of all, welcome. Thank you so much for all of you taking the time to be part of this presentation. Once again, the title is States' Role in Developing Effective Principals. I'm Paulo Di Maria. I'm the president and CEO of the National Association of State Boards of Education, who is bringing you this webinar today. For those of you who are not familiar with NASBE, we are a nonpartisan, nonprofit, member-driven organization that supports members of state boards of education. And those state boards often serve as the sort of the citizen voice, that balanced center of the education policy-making arena. We pride ourselves in not only supporting members, but being governed by them through our board of directors, through our various committee structures, and so forth and so on. Let me review a few of the norms for this webinar. First of all, we are recording the webinar, and the recording will be distributed to participants. We're also happy to make materials available, and that will include things like the slides and so forth and so on. We have enabled the closed captioning. We also would like you to use the Q&A box to submit any questions that you might have at any time. I want to thank those of you who submitted questions with your registration. We will use that to inform the conversation today. We also suggest that you keep an eye on the chat box for various resource links that will be posted throughout the presentation. This webinar is going to be divided into two parts. There's going to be the main webinar, but then NASBE members who are individuals with state boards of education, you all should stay on at the end, and we'll give you instructions about how to join. We'll all go to we'll all convene in this room, but we'll be able to see your faces and hear your audio in order to have a deeper conversation so that you can engage with our panelists. I love this topic because I have seen in my history and my own experience the tremendous importance of principals to school excellence and student learning. In fact, the research shows that is a very second to teachers in school, principals matter the most in terms of the achievement of students. We at NASBE, of course, we hear from our members. Members of state boards of education about the importance of this topic, because they are constantly on the lookout for how do we continue to drive improvement and excellence in our state's education systems. And one of the things that always surfaces to the top are principals. We've in fact published a number of publications about principals. You see several of them here on your screen. Strengthening the principal pipeline through state leadership academies. We will talk about state leadership academies in our conversation today. Preparing principals through high quality internships. We're always on the lookout for very innovative strategies to principal preparation. We're also a longtime grantee of the Wallace Foundation. The Wallace Foundation, I tip my hat to them, as doing the finest and supporting the finest work in principal preparation research and promoting in the nation. Several of their publications will be discussed in today's conversation. And in fact, they are the ones that have supported the research that the Learning Policy Institute has done in this regard. I also, when I think about principals, I think how fundamental they are to just about any other kinds of improvement implementation that's going on. If you're working on the science of reading or tutoring or out of school linkages or the use of technology or the use of high quality instructional materials or improving instructional practices or any one of those things, ultimately the principal has to play an important role in those conversations, in those plans, in building the culture that's required to make those things happen successfully. And that's really why we're having this conversation today. There's a lot of focus across this country on teacher retention, teacher recruitment, but we also need to pay attention to the quality of those individuals leading our schools and leading our teachers, because they make a huge difference. So you've got, like I said, a great panel of participants. We're going to start with the incomparable Linda Darling-Hammond. Linda, I always start by saying Linda's a native of Cleveland, because I'm also in Ohio, but she has an illustrious career that I cannot summarize in the few seconds that I have to introduce her. Suffice it to say that most of you know her. She is a member and the chair of the California State Board of Education, as well as the president of the Learning Policy Institute. She's on the faculty at Stanford University and holds any number of awards, book publications, and articles, and we're so delighted to have her with us. Delia Arancibia is the principal at Chula Vista Elementary School. She is a product of San Diego State University and their principal preparation program, which is a program that was designed with based on a lot of the research that the Wallace Foundation has conducted, and she'll be speaking as our sort of practitioner. And every day on the ground in the trenches doing the work and really being able to reflect on the kinds of things that we want state policymakers to be able to know and understand and engage with. And then finally, Bonnie Fusarelli, she's a distinguished professor and she's the director at North Carolina State University's Principal Leadership Academies. Again, brings a wealth of understanding. Those academies also are derived from the great research that has happened around effective principals. And she's here to give us the perspective of what kinds of state initiatives, state mechanisms in collaboration with higher education can be put into place to increase the likelihood that the principals that are trained are going to be successful in not only regular districts and school buildings, but in particularly challenged ones. So with that, Linda, I'm going to turn it over to you and have you get us started.
Terrific. Thank you so much. And I too am a fan of the Wallace Foundation. I used to be on their board when they made the commitment to continue to stay in this principal, research and policy space, and we have all benefited so much from that around the country. Let me see if I can figure out how to share my screen properly here. And there we go. All right, the technology gods are smiling on us today.
All right, we see your screen.
Yep, we're good. So we were asked to do a study by Wallace on developing effective principles, what kind of learning matters. So there have been lots of studies that have demonstrated that principles do make a big difference in many, many outcomes for students and for schools. And they upped that set of studies with a group of folks from Vanderbilt University who looked at that research and then asked us to look at the kind of learning that matters. Back in 2007, I was part of a team that did a study called Preparing School Leaders for a Changing World, also Wallace funded. And we found at that point that effective principal preparation and development programs can transform practice and increase principal success. And that powerful preparation also increases the likelihood of people staying. That when you feel more efficacious, when you feel more prepared, the work is easier in that sense. Not that the work is ever very easy, but it is manageable and you can achieve successes, and those are part of what stimulate retention. So, of course, we know that principles matter, and the team at Vanderbilt that I just mentioned, Jason Grissom and his colleagues, basically said, it is difficult to envision an investment with a higher ceiling on its potential return than a successful effort to improve principal leadership. And they then document all the ways in which principal leadership makes a difference in school outcomes from the most recent studies. We also found, reviewing the literature and doing some studies on our own, that a comprehensive principal preparation that includes the things I'm about to mention and professional development are positively associated with both how principals feel, their skills and their efficacy, their attitudes, their perceptions of being well prepared, how teachers feel in their buildings, whether they're satisfied and stay, and how students achieve, with attendance, achievement, and graduation rates among the outcomes. And we think about what principals know and do. Of course, leaders have their lived experiences that they bring to the table that are important. Their preparation has certain kinds of content that matter: instructional leadership, school improvement and change management skills, school conditions, being able to create a positive climate, develop the staff, develop the people in the school, including parents, by the way, who are part of that process, and then meeting diverse students' needs. All of these have come up in the research as key things that, when principals learn them, improve their outcomes and practices. It also matters how we do professional learning. It turns out that if learning is applied, if you're applying it as you go to real problems of practice, if you have a serious internship under the wing of an expert principal for an extended period of time, if you get coaching and mentoring, and if you are a part of a cohort or a network of principals where you can problem solve together, these things produce better outcomes than sit and get instruction where you're sitting in a lecture hall and just learning things. We interviewed and read about a number of principles in the literature review. As one of them said, it's the structure of the program, the projects, and the way we'd read something, reflect on it, and have time to apply those concepts. It was through the application that you could see the big picture. The learning by doing had the biggest impact on me, and that came from the structure of the program. And I want to emphasize this because powerful internships are important, but they're relatively rare, and that is partly a function of the way states have thought about their standards. Another leader said, I've got an understanding of what it means to create and try to live by a vision. So it guides any decisions I make. That's a whole new understanding of what it means to be an instructional leader. A third one noted, I used to think about the core work. I used to think that the core work was about managing people at a school. I now think it's about ensuring that there's a transformation. And in order to do that, we have to make sure that everyone is learning and engaged in the transformation. So these are the things that come from clinical practice, applying the learning along with getting the theory. And we saw that over time, there's more and more access to the important content areas that I mentioned. About 2/3 of principals nationally reported that they had access to content about those matters, and that it has improved over the past 10 years for those who've been certified in the past 10 years around how to use data, how to recruit and retain teachers and staff, meeting the needs of diverse learners, including English learners. But relatively few principals have access to the high leverage learning opportunities. Only 46% had experienced internships where they had administrative responsibilities and coaching as part of their preparation, despite how very, very powerful that is. Only a third had experienced peer observation at least 3 times in the previous 3 years. Only about half had participated in a principal network 3 or more times in the previous 3 years. So we found that, the too much of the learning is still sit and get. And there's a need to really bring these kinds of practices to the fore. And access to professional development is really different across states. So state leaders have a role in how this gets determined. We happen to have data from surveys in North Carolina and California with similar questions. So we were able to compare those 2 states. And you can see that at this moment in time, which was around 2020 or maybe 2021, there were many more principals in California getting certain kinds of professional development, especially about meeting the needs of all learners, equitably serving them, leading schools that support diverse learners, et cetera. So that is actually a policy matter. And now it's not advancing for me. There we go. And we also found that access across the country differs by school poverty level. So high poverty schools had less access to professional development than low poverty schools in a variety of areas. And here are some of the ones that you can see that really differed across school types. Principals really want professional development. We had more than 3/4, more than 75%, who uniformly across the country wanted more professional development around social emotional development, students' physical and mental health, leading a school-wide process to improve student achievement, redesigning for deeper learning, creating an environment that develops responsible young people, and so on. A lot of it was really around the professional learning that's needed to create a whole child supportive environment and to move learning forward in a way that pays attention to higher order thinking, to deeper learning, not just to remembering and spitting back facts. So there's a thirst and a hunger for a high quality professional learning. Professional development policy can make a difference, and state boards have some important roles in that policy. One role that's very important is the role of setting standards. It's something that state boards do. What are the standards that will guide preparation, licensing, program approval or accreditation. There's been a big shift in time about the standards. In 2005, about 20 years ago, there were only 6 states that really focused on the knowledge and skills principals might need to support student learning, as opposed to getting the buses running on time and managing the budget and other things. And of the states that at least mentioned those skills, most did not really specify what that means. By 2014, we had 35 states revising their standards. All of the states had adopted the ISLIC standards and at least mentioned the idea that principals should know how to support student learning in the building. In 2018, the field developed the National Educational Leadership Preparation NELP standards, and those evolved in different states to different names. In California, they were picked up and added to and called the capsules, the California professional preparation standards. These really reinforced equity and clinical practice tied to meaningful coursework. And when the standards affect accreditation or program approval, as well as licensure, they can have a big effect on what programs actually provide and what they do. And I think that's a big part of the story for us. The states have adopted competing approaches to principal policy. We have 50 states now engaged in some kind of policy to improve principal quality. Many used the ESSA funds and then the ESSER funds. They came more recently as part of the Recovery Act to pursue leadership standards and new approaches to clinical training and mentoring and team training, et cetera, academies. But most are pursuing both stronger requirements for programs and alternative pathways that don't require everyone to go through those programs. And the fastest growing sector is online for-profit training programs, and they can make a big difference the various reforms can make a big difference in outcomes. We, in the course of it, reviewed surveys from a number of states. One set of surveys in Colorado, which had seen the growth of many for-profit alternative pathways that were entirely online for preparation to become a principal, found that existing superintendents found those programs to be the least helpful in training principals that they could hire and rely on to know what to do. In Illinois, there had been a different reform that I'm going to mention to you in a moment, and superintendents in a survey there talked about how valuable those reforms had been and how how positively they viewed the principals who'd had that training. So these policies can really make a difference in one direction or another. The University Council for Educational Administration identified a set of high leverage policies that are really supported by the research for program approval and for candidate licensure. Among those for program approval, and the one with the asterisks have the strongest recent research on effectiveness producing approaches. Proactively selecting and recruiting candidates, really looking for high quality dynamic teachers who are showing leadership and persuading them to come into the principal training program, not just waiting to see who shows up. Obviously, the use of standards matters. Clinically rich internships that really give you the experience of being an administrator under the wing of an administrator, rather than just being a teacher in the classroom, trying to do projects that would imagine what you might do if you were in that role, which has been commonly the case. Strong partnerships between universities and districts, where the university is helping prepare candidates for what the district needs them to be able to do, and using those applications in the process. Regular state oversight with feedback, where somebody's coming in and really looking at what the program is doing, what the graduates believe they've learned, and then giving that feedback as part of the program approval process. In terms of licensure, requiring a certain amount of experience as an educator and a certain education has high leverage on what ultimately results. Assessments are a new thing that include, for example, portfolio review. Places like Connecticut, Massachusetts, California have been doing that now statewide, but many, many programs do that in the course of their training. And then license renewal. with continuing education. And they found back in about 2015 that only 2 states met the criteria for all of the high leverage policies. 11 didn't meet any, and that states were more likely to legislate licensure policies than program approval strategies, but the latter have a stronger evidence base in the literature and according to program leaders, can have a stronger effect. So don't ignore the program approval or accreditation requirements. That, in fact, was the strategy that Illinois did take up, producing really positive changes in preparation programs. They required that programs have partnerships with districts, that they rigorously select and recruit their candidates, that they align with standards, have a year-long internship, which is a very pioneering step at that moment in time, and that they use competency-based assessments rather than multiple choice tests. And that led to positive changes that were documented in many, many studies that went on, including recruiting fewer candidates, but training them much better. One of the interesting things that's been found is that of the people who go get a credential in administration, and certainly at least before the pandemic, most of those folks were doing that to get a jump on the salary schedule, but really didn't intend to go in the principalship, and only about 20% in a lot of states actually went into the principalship. So a lot of people were getting trained, but not in a very high quality way, and were not really contributing to the pool or the pipeline. They also saw more diversity, they saw more meaningful internships, and they saw this focus in the programs on continuous improvement. And there has been a strong increase in achievement, especially in Chicago, which led those reforms and engaged in them before the rest of the state did, that it's been one of the highest improving districts, and the state as a whole has been making gains. And the principals who were trained in this way were found to be more effective early on than the principals who lacked this kind of training. California did some comprehensive reforms, new standards that focused both on program approval and on licensure, that also focused on these key areas of principal learning that I mentioned, and also had this whole child supports approach to deeper learning, social, emotional, and cognitive learning, and built that into the program expectations. They have administrator performance expectations that guide everything, including the program accreditation, the licensure, the induction program requirements, and an administrator performance assessment that administrative leaders in the state worked on with the credentialing commission, and requires administrators to demonstrate how they would take a body of data, and from that and from particular kinds of work with their community, come up with a school improvement plan, and also then to look at performances of teachers and to be able to think about how they would support the professional learning and growth of teachers. And then, of course, these standards informed the work of a new school leadership academy, which is funded by the Title II 3% set aside, which can be used by states for the purpose of leadership development. And it's an important source of funding that state boards should be aware of. They've also then, of course, the Leadership Academy has supported the induction mentoring. The policy changes really appeared to influence principals' access to learning about key topics. This is about midway through the reforms. You can see the growth from recent completers of programs in their knowledge base for being instructional leaders and managing school improvement, shaping those learning conditions, meeting the needs of diverse learners. So you could see some real changes in what people felt prepared to do, felt they had gotten good training to do. And this is the differential in their feelings of being well prepared. And we think it's even higher now that the reforms are fully implemented. North Carolina is another state that led the way on principal preparation, and Bonnie Fusarelli will tell us more about this in a few minutes. After updating its standards some years ago, and it's updated them several times since, North Carolina took steps to create new program designs that didn't exist. One way they did this was through the North Carolina Principal Fellows Program. Started in 1993, it has contributed more than 1,000 principals to the state of North Carolina. It was the first state to offer state support for preparation and a year-long paid internship, which is negotiated with the districts that provided assistant principal placements and contribute to the paying of the internship in that way, while the state is also partnering in the funding for the master's degree that results from this training. There was a recent set of studies conducted by Kevin Bastian and others at UNC who found that more of these candidates became principals, way more, stayed principals, and were viewed as effective than other principals who came from out of state or were not in this program. That was merged recently with the Transforming Principal Preparation Program and now offers this training in 8 universities. Again, this is reflected in the way in which the state manages the program and essentially recruits the universities to be part of the transformation. The North Carolina State Educational Leadership Academy, fondly known as NELA, which Bonnie again will tell us more about, offers a very comprehensive leadership development approach, not limited only to preparing initial principles. It's across like a succession planning, and they look at how to do this with high poverty, hard to staff, historically low performing schools in mind, and have gotten quite a reputation. Again, the state's support for these programs enables certain models to start to emerge, be understood, and then be emulated by other programs. One last thing I'll mention is the Urban Pipeline Project that Wallace funded, which got positive learning gains from the students in schools where the early trained principals were assigned. And they also got higher principal retention from it. You can see the cities that are on the left-hand side of the page. And they adopted standards of practice and performance to guide principal preparation, hiring, evaluation, and support. So this coherence of using the standards across the whole continuum. They delivered high-quality pre-service preparation to high-potential candidates who were recruited into the programs. They used selective hiring and placement informed by data on the skills of the principals so that they could get principals into the schools where they would be able to be most effective. This is an interesting thing that folks rarely think about. And then they aligned on-the-job evaluation and support for the novice principals with the standards. And they also developed principal supervisors' skills in supporting the principals and in displaying instructional leadership. Programs like this then have been started in other places since this early study. And among the places that I know some of this training has been taken up is in San Diego. And we're going to hear a little later from Delia Arancibia, who experienced some of that opportunity and now works in nearby Chula Vista. We studied Chula Vista in a Learning Policy Institute study on positive outliers and found that they outperform most districts in California for Latinx, Black, and white students alike. And a lot of that has to do with the training of the teachers and principals that they recruit and contribute to. So what can we do as state board members? We can really think about what is the content of our state licensing and program approval standards and see that they're updated and that they have the expectations for the kind of learning that we know makes a difference in principal effectiveness. We can also look at the expectations for program design, which is part of what you can call for in program approval standards, and internships under the wing of expert principals are incredibly important for the outcomes that we found for principals. We can apply those standards to assessments, performance assessments or others, induction, professional learning, and evaluation, so that we're creating coherence. We can invest in a statewide infrastructure for professional learning if we have access to targeting, things like the ESA, 3% set aside or other federal funds. Those can include principals' academies. And we can encourage excellent models by holding them up, by partnering with programs, with universities and districts to help them create these kind of pipelines. You can find more about this in a Learning Policy Institute report on developing effective principles, and a new book which goes a little further to give more of the stories of the programs and the ways in which principals experience them in our new book of Developing Expert Principals. And with that, I'm going to hand the ball back to Paolo.
Great, Linda. Thank you so much. That was wonderful. I love the way you ended about stories, because I'm such a fan of school success stories. And invariably, when you read like Schools That Succeed by Karen Chenoweth and the history of maybe the Chicago initiatives, it always comes down to the story of a great leader, a great principal who may not be the strongest instructional leader or cultural leader, but they have the right combination of skills and abilities to really create a powerful learning experience for the students in those schools. So one of the things that listeners know, my style is I want you to come away from this webinar with a couple of things that you're actually going to do. Now, Linda has given you five great things. And I always try to frame these things as questions, because I know you're coming to this webinar saying, hey, I'm kind of interested in this topic, but what can I do? And some of it's just starting to ask questions and get some answers. Like, when was the last time our state updated our standards? Is there an office in our department that's focused on principal quality, principal improvement, not just the licensure side of the equation, but is somebody getting up every day thinking about how do we as a state support effective principals? Does it reflect a real commitment? Do we bring together the people that are interested in excellent principalships, the higher ed institutions, maybe the superintendents and the different principals associations in our state to talk about these things and to continue to drive excellence? Are we leveraging some of our regional service providers to be champions of high quality principal activity? So think about, as we go through the rest of this conversation, what are those other things that you might ask about, and maybe a few preliminary steps that you might take to say, hey, we need to commit in our state to doing this better. Delia, I'm going to go to you now because you're the practitioner, right? You've just heard Linda, articulate all these things that we know, make for great principals. And I want you to reflect a little bit on your pre-service experience. What were those kinds of, did you have an internship or a network operator? What were the sorts of things that you, as you reflect on, really made a powerful impact on the principal that you are today?
Thank you, Paolo. I want to start by just echoing one of the very first things that Linda started out with was that the more prepared you feel as a principal entering into the profession, the more likely you are to stay. And as a graduate of San Diego State's administrative credential program, I can 100% wholeheartedly say that I felt absolutely confident walking into that interview principal, and I felt prepared. I felt prepared because I could speak to all of the areas that were responsible as principals. I could speak to the instructional side. I could speak to the social emotional, that whole child that Linda was talking about. I could speak to the management, the systems and the budget, the operations that principals are responsible for. I could speak to how to support diverse learners. I was able to speak to each of those pieces walking into that principal role. But I want to add, there's a few things that, in particular, my experience at San Diego State really, I lean on now even, is that focus on being an equity-driven leader and how equity is really permeated in all of those areas. One of the phrases that I've sort of coined as a principal, with talking with colleagues, is shining the light. So how are we as principals shining the light on the student populations that are not yet at grade level? What are the things that we are doing to support those students? So really that equity is always the driving focus. And then, a part of that also is, because we have all of those responsibilities, what are we doing as a systems thinker to really support and ensure that all of those things are in place? So I still have to do, I still have to create schedules. I still have to make sure there's somebody watching my students at recess. I still have to, ensure the safety of the campus. I still have to manage a budget. I do all of those pieces, but when there are systems in place to support those things, my role becomes a little bit easier and I can focus more of my energies on those instructional pieces. It's the systems that are about the daily operations, but it's also the systems of instruction and how, like I said, how are we supporting those diverse learners? For example, if I think about what we coin MTSS, so the multi-tiered systems of support, how does that exist at my school site? What are the systems, the procedures that I've implemented to ensure that when students aren't yet at grade level, how are we supporting them? What are the process that we have to do that? So that's another layer of that systems thinking. And then finally, when I think about my preparation at San Diego State, I also want to really hit home the idea of the piece of being very reflective as a leader and the piece of being 110% grounded in what my core values and beliefs are. What is it that I firmly believe? What are the values that I'm going to lean on in those moments when I do have to make difficult decisions? For a variety of reasons, that we make. So those are the key things that stand out to me from my preparation. I wasn't a part of an internship per se, but I did have when I became an administrator, I was able to work with San Diego State for induction. So for 2 years, I had a coach, and that was invaluable. Again, our novice, our very green principals need that support along the way. And I was fortunate to have that also with San Diego State.
Yeah, because I mean, a lot of the great learning happens, I mean, or it's locked in when you're actually having to do it. And whether it's an internship or through a coaching model or just the experience, many people gain that experience as an assistant principal, right?
Mm-hmm.
And they're being mentored by the principal in their particular building. Are there any particular skills and dispositions that stand out to you that you have found to really have given you, especially that comfort of knowing that you're doing a great job with your particular team?
I want to just lean back on that equity piece. That is what I always lean on. And so in the actions that I'm making, right? So part of the preparation was really thinking about the choices, the actions, the decisions that you're making, because as leaders, the choices that we make impact, in my case, 445 students and their families. And so making sure that I'm able to really speak to why it is that I made a decision through that equity lens.
Yeah, because at the end of the day, our mission is really for each child, right?
Mm-hmm.
To provide them with what they need to be excellent. And it could be a low income child, could be a minority child, could be a special ed child,
Mm-hmm.
all those places where we know we're all different. We all have different identities. And yet we can all achieve success. Delia, I'm going to come back to you and ask you some questions about what kind of support do you get currently and some of the role that you're playing in training upcoming principals. But I'm teeing that up for you to think about while I go to Bonnie, because I want to have Bonnie reflect on the great work happening in North Carolina. You heard Linda sort of tee that up. Say a little bit about what the academies do. Maybe a little bit about what their genesis was. To what extent was the state board involved in their development, and the impact that you're having in North Carolina?
Well, thank you so much. Those are a lot of questions, and I'll try to hit a couple of the high points as quickly as possible. So, as Linda mentioned, Principal Fellows was a program that was created back in the 90s, and that actually funded the student received the money, and they could go wherever they wanted to go to get their training. And what some of the more recent changes in the Principal Fellows program is changed it so that, yes, the student still has to pay back the money because it's a scholarship loan. They have to do service in the schools to pay it back. But the institutions that meet certain criteria are the ones that then have the funding. And so it's kind of flipped it on its head to make sure that instead of being able to take state funds to just any program, and I love how Steve Tozer, my friend in Illinois, always says, you shouldn't be able to get your principal license in your jammies. And so, there's things like that, right? So we want to make sure our people go to the high quality programs that really do have the internships, et cetera, that Linda spoke about. And so that's what Principal Fellows has really done. So Principal Fellows has been around for a long time. It was kind of not utilized to the extent that it should have been, partially because the students almost always had to take a major pay cut to participate. And so over the years, for example, NC State, we wrote ourselves I wrote the part of the section for our Race to Top initiative. So we wrote principal preparation programs into that as part of our Race to the Top. And we were able to get 3 leadership academies funded through Race to the Top funds. And then U.S. Department of Ed funding kept us going, or kept NC State going of the 3. And in our UNC systems leader put Principal Fellows at NC State. And the reason that she did that at the time was because of all the work that we had been doing in this space. And historically, the head of Principal Fellows was just isolated in a systems office, no interaction with anybody that has anything to do with principal prep or in the schools on any day. And so that was great, but then there were politics involved. And so that got pulled back to the state organization again. But the real story behind a lot of this, and there is a merger with another program, but the real story behind this is that they took Principal Fellows, which was an already existing but majorly underutilized revenue source that the legislature established in the 90s. And it's now become a grant opportunity where programs can apply for funding to support principals preparation. And there's certain criteria. I can send links to it, but it's actually spelled out in legislation, the criteria, and they're those high leverage pieces, what the programs have to be able to provide. That's a long answer. What was your other questions? Any of them?
Say a little bit more about the programming. In other words, it's not it's not the same principal preparation program as it was 40 years ago. What are some of the things you're doing differently? What are the deficiencies that we've seen, or the dispositions and skills that you're specifically trying to nurture in the candidates that are in the academies, and that speak to some of the needs that Linda talked about?
Yeah, absolutely. And so unlike Delia, when I finished my degree, my Master's of School Administration degree, and it was actually at one of the better programs in the country, it's been an award-winning program, I did not feel ready. And so when I got out of grad school, I was like, if I'm going to be doing this work, I have to make sure that it's going to be work that makes people day one ready. So we actually we were one of the Wallace UPPI initiatives, but that was after we'd already been doing some of our work, because we got funding from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation to do some vision work. And so some of the things that we really zoned in on, it was, what are those high leverage, just like Linda was saying, what are those high leverage activities that we can have our fellows engage in? And notice I said activities, not just sitting and getting, so that they can be really well prepared. And I think some of the hallmarks of our program is really about, like what Delia said, about reflection, getting in the hearts and minds of the students. We have our students do a day in the life where they follow developmentally from pre-K feeder schools all the way elementary, middle school, high school, and then to adults, incarceration centers, et cetera. So they can really understand what developmental psychology looks like, what developmental children's development is across the age spectrum. And I think that really helps them to pay more attention to student voice, pay more attention to what is it like to be in your building and or in their school building. And I think that has really helped them to be the kinds of leaders where, throughout an outcome, 90% of our graduates meet or exceed expectations as far as on student achievement, versus 75% of school leaders statewide. And if you compare our graduates within their own districts, their own school districts, they're still at 90 and their peers are at 63%. And so there's something there, right? And some of the magic really is the year-long internship, year-long residency with strategic coaching, not just from the mentor principal, because there are districts that we work with, especially early on, that I had a really hard time finding a principal that I'd want to be the mentor. And you should have seen my spreadsheets. I had these spreadsheets of their student scores and reputational things, and have they gone through coaching training? And I'd highlight them in colors. And unfortunately, some of the districts, they were all red, meaning no way would I put one of our fellows with that. And so we implemented a very strong coaching model where our fellows are given an executive coach who follows them for their entire internship year, but they also have a cohort coach who is tracking them and their performance from day one in our program till 2 years post-degree. And so the importance of that is that you have continuity of somebody who has watched their development over time. We jokingly say it's our good housekeeping warranty. That, if there's something that you don't know or something new that came up, we are going to provide a training on that for free, professional development, usually in the summers, usually in August, for all of our grads and anybody else who wants to come, because that's part of being a land-grant institution, is we're supposed to be providing service to the state. So I think there are a lot of different things, but the real levers are in the details. Some of the things that we're not seeing, unfortunately, in some other graduates, not ours, but other graduates, because we're being asked to come in and retrofit some folks, is also just dispositional. Do you really love people? I mean, if you don't love people, you shouldn't be in this work. And if you don't love working with adults, you shouldn't be in leadership. And there are things like that, but also just like having a graciousness of understanding that everybody has a story. That doesn't mean you're going to lower your expectations. In fact, that might mean you're ratcheting them up, but you also need to be gracious and giving people space to voice their concerns, et cetera.
I mean, it actually speaks to that skill set that you're not only the instructional leader, you're also the culture leader, right? You're building the family, you're building the cohesiveness of an organization.
Yeah, and part of that comes from our fellows all do a residency pre their internship. So they do a summer in the community agencies that serve the school. And they do basic things like interviews with Boys and Girls Club and that sort of stuff, but they actually have to volunteer as part of their internship requirements in a community agency that serves the schools. And that really helps them to see through the lens of the community, what does the community want and need? And probably won't surprise anybody on this call, but one of the things we actually had to implement pretty early was local school board training. So we actually had to go in and do some local school board training so that they were hiring based on competencies, knowing what those high leverage things are. And they were hiring their principals based on competencies versus it's my cousin who needs a job. And I say that kind of tongue in cheek, but that's really the way it is in some of these, especially in some of the rural areas.
Great. Thanks, Bonnie. Delia, I'm going to come back to you now. You're now a principal. Are you networked with peers? Are you getting the support you need from your district? And what are the kinds of things that you're doing to sort of ensure the continuity of great principal development for Chula Vista?
Yeah, so I'm very fortunate to work in a district where, because we are the largest elementary school district in the state of California, we are grouped into cohorts. And each cohort has a principal lead. And we worked in that kind of smaller group of anywhere from 7 to 8 principals to really support each other. We walk through each other's schools. We have instructional conversations. What are we doing for our next professional learning cycle? How can I support you? Can you be my thought partner? Let me talk to you about this. Right. All of those pieces are really, really strong in Chula Vista. The other thing I want to lean back to what Linda was saying there, there's a thirst and hunger, she said, for principals wanting to learn. And I would say that that's definitely something that we as principals continue to really need, is that ongoing professional development. I think in my ideal world, there would be a partnership with local school districts and universities to kind of really bridge that, make that connection to be able to support principals in the work that we do. I've been fortunate enough to be now a lecturer in the same program that I graduated from, as well as now, like I said, bringing along the newer principals. I'm mentoring a newer principal as well. So again, just that that being that thought partner, those coaching models are really, really critical.
I want to build on what you just said. You know, are we taking the right steps to make the principalship an attractive endeavor? I mean, obviously, some of what we've talked about here, if we can better train you and develop you so that it's an enjoyable experience, that's going to make a contribution. Are there other things we should be doing to attract people into this part of the education talent force?
I do think that there's definitely some work to be done in terms of recruiting principals, and I would be amiss to say that I think it's really extra important to really expand the principals in terms of the diversity of principals. I think across the country, I know in California for sure, that's really critical. But another piece that I would say, you know, kind of going back to what I was saying earlier about the systems and the management piece of it.
Right.
So if as the principal, I am that instructional leader, if there were staff that could support to do some of those pieces, for example, if I had a full-time counselor, which I'm fortunate to have, but I know not all schools do, can that person work in a capacity that supports some of those social emotional pieces? If I had an instructional coach, could that person work to support some of those pieces? And then the other piece is really building as principals, getting that learning to build the capacity of our teachers and our staff to be leaders on site, because one person can't do all of it.
Right.
But working to build that collective efficacy.
Yeah, in fact, one of the questions we got in advance was about collaborative leadership. And it sounds like you've just described part of it's, you know, how you as a principal are trained to identify those opportunities for collaborative leadership and establish some of those systems to get the work done that you see as being needed, that you just can't do. You know, you can't expect one person to do everything around. We've had a question come in the Q&A that says, is there any particular research about that clinical practice component in terms of, you know, the length of an internship or what a residency might look like or how you prepare mentor principals? Is that built out very much? Linda, do you happen to know?
There's some, and you know, what we're hearing from Bonnie is about what it looks like when you put that research into practice. So, yeah, that typically the programs that get strong outcomes have at least a semester, but sometimes a full year of an internship under the wing of an expert principal. Some places that are trying to deal with having less money will make that happen during the summertime, you know, in a summer school program, which is a little shorter, but it gives that opportunity. There's evidence that mentor training is important and has to do not only with what your own leadership style is and what you do in your leading, but also how you work with others in a mentoring capacity. How do you give feedback in constructive ways that, you know, identify strengths and then also identify places for reflection? How do you spark that reflection and provide, you know, learning resources? If these clinical experiences are tied to some other kind of coursework, those can be very, very helpful because it can, you know, guide the reflection and learning process that's going on. You know, being a principal is so active. Quote of the day. What was the quote? You shouldn't be able to get your administrative certificate in your jammies. If you think about what principals are doing, I mean, it's a very active job. And so you don't have a lot of time to think deeply when you're in the middle of it, but you need time to reflect and sit back and say, okay, now let me make some sense of what's going on there. So I do think that, you know, having those opportunities while you're doing the clinical work is also important. And I would punt this back to Bonnie and Delia in terms of other things that they have built on in their thinking and or experienced. Yeah.
Do you two want to go ahead and reflect?
Well, I did mention, so I am currently mentoring a new principal, and it's about even scheduling those monthly, weekly times to get together. I do leave it a little bit open in terms of, okay, this week, this month, what was a challenge for you? And we discuss through those pieces. I have to model some of that in terms of, okay, tell me how you would have approached this, or how you approached it if it's already happened. And tell me why, right? Going back to those core values, going back to that equity-driven leader, why is it that you made the decision? And Linda's absolutely right. I think I said in the first time that we met, as a principal, we joke amongst each other. We have probably like 20 tabs open in our brain at one time because we're, thinking about all of the things. But, just offering that space to new principals to be able to reflect on the decisions that they've made.
Yeah. And I'd just like to note that the research also shows that the frequency of feedback, as well as the quality of feedback, do make a difference as well.
And I think there's some very concrete things that we can do to make sure that during the residency, we call it a residency, our internship, you're getting the kinds of experiences that you need. So we've done some time studies, and we literally push out to all of our students' phones, what are you doing right now? They have to reflect at the end of every day. And this is where technology and AI is beautiful. We can track exactly how they're spending their time. And if they're not getting to those key things, like doing teacher evaluations, we can have a conversation with their mentor principal and say, here's some database conversation that, they aren't getting everything that they need. I think one thing that's really important about IHEs sometimes needing to lead some of this work is, one, because we are the researchers, right? We're doing some of the research in this area, but also needing our district partners to be the practitioner influence and leaning that in. But you just hit the nail on the head when you were talking about just how overwhelmed and busy, leaders in schools, and that goes from the school level leader to the district level leader. So really being able to think about what's ahead, how can we best prioritize, what's next, is sometimes really difficult, where us in our ivory tower sometimes have the luxury of sitting back and thinking about that. And I'll give you one important example. So in our program, we've been, since 2010, doing training, very intensive training for existing principals and aspiring principals on being an instructional leader in a digital learning environment since 2010. And our folks learned how to do flipped classrooms and all of that. And so when COVID hit, it was an easy shift for our folks. They created micro schools. They were leading their districts as far as the digital transition, because we were thinking ahead about what's next. And I think that that's really, really important, because we don't want to always replicate the status quo, right? We want to do something different to improve schools. Otherwise, they'd be doing great.
Right. Well, and how to manage those changes, because as much as we want to think you can put improvement in place overnight and then just let it go, you're constantly working on improvement opportunities. We are at the top of the hour, so I want to give a great big thank you to Delia, to Bonnie, to Linda. As I said before, if you are a listener and you are a State Board of Education member, please stay on this Zoom link. You will see on your screen something appear that wants to promote you to be a presenter. If you accept that, you will be put into a room with all of us, and we'll be able to have a NASBE-focused office hours sort of experience where we're able to interact with our panelists and let them know. Hopefully, based on Linda's presentation, my presentation, my challenges to you to take action, and the things that you've heard from our wonderful panelists, you will go back and you have a little checklist of things that you might want to ask about. If you want further information, don't hesitate to contact us at NASBE. You can find us at NASBE.org. And our email addresses are listed there. We're happy to interface with you, interact with you, support you in the work that you do, because it is so very, very important. We would love to know that every state is doing the same kinds of things that California and North Carolina, and not to say that there aren't other great stories. Illinois was mentioned, Colorado was mentioned. So there are a lot of people paying attention, but I think there's always room for further improvement, and we want to be helpful in that respect. So with that, again, thank you to all of you who have joined us, who will be